echoes in the marble, ancient Rome's conspiracies of truth. Rome was not built in a day, the proverb goes. But neither was it unmade in one. For centuries, the story of the Roman Empire, from its mythical founding by Romulus and Remus to its slow, agonizing transformation into the Byzantine and the medieval, has been presented to us as a linear narrative. A triumphal march of law, legions, and Latin. We are taught of Augustus bringing the Pax Romana, of the Senate as a bastion of republican virtue, of emperors who were either mad tyrants or enlightened despots. This is the marble facade. But beneath the gleaming surface of the residential publica and the imperium lay a world that modern conspiracy theorists would recognize instantly. It was a world of whispers in the domus, of anonymous letters scratched onto walls, of Praetorian guards who made and murdered emperors for a price, and of a populace that understood, perhaps more than we do today, that history was written by the victors, and the victors were often the most ruthless liars. What makes the study of Roman conspiracy theories so unique is not that they were mere paranoid fantasies. It is that so many of them were absolutely, verifiably true. The conspiracy was not a fringe idea, it was the very operating system of the Roman state. For every story of a hidden cabal poisoning a potential heir, there is a mass grave or a letter from a contemporary to confirm it. For every tale of a fire being deliberately set to clear land for a palace, there is a historical account from multiple, hostile sources. This work is not a work of fiction. It is an exploration of the documented, historical conspiracies, the plots, the intrigues, the cover-ups, and the inconvenient truths that the empire tried to bury, only to have them excavated by later historians, archaeologists, and forensic analysis. We will begin not with the fall, but with the very foundation. Because if the origin story of Rome itself is built on a conspiracy of fratricide, then the city was always destined to be a place where power was taken, not given. The bloody cradle, conspiracies of the monarchy and early republic. The wolf and the twin, the original sin. The story is familiar. The princess Rhea Silvia, violated by the god Mars, gives birth to twin sons, Romulus and Remus. Abandoned in a basket on the Tiber, they are suckled by a she-wolf and raised by a shepherd. They grow to become leaders, and eventually, they decide to found a new city on the banks of the river where they were saved. But the traditional narrative, codified by Livy and Plutarch centuries later, contains a conspiracy that historians and archaeologists now believe is a coded confession of Rome's foundational political murder, the killing of Remus. In the official story, Romulus sees birds, a sign of divine favor, first. Remus, jealous, leaps over the half-built walls his brother is constructing. Romulus kills him, declaring, "So perish every one that shall hereafter leap over my wall." For centuries, this was interpreted as a myth explaining the sanctity of Rome's borders. But a deeper, more cynical reading, one that was whispered in the late Republic, suggests a more sinister truth. The she-wolf Lupa was also Roman slang for a prostitute. The shepherd who raised them was likely a political refugee. The conspiracy theory, which gained traction in the 1st century BCE, was that the founding of Rome was not a divine act but a coup. The theory posits that Romulus and Remus were not divine-licide princes, but ambitious bandit lords who seized control of the Palatine Hill. The murder of Remus was not a spontaneous act of anger over a war, it was a calculated political assassination, the first in a long line. Romulus eliminated his co-leader and instituted a monarchy based on the outcasts, criminals, and fugitives, a conspiracy of the desperate that formed the city's first power base. But the conspiracy does not end there. The fate of Romulus himself is even more damning. After a reign of nearly 40 years, Romulus was said to have vanished in a sudden storm. The official story, spread by the patrician class, was that he was taken up to heaven to become the god Quirinus. The common people wept. The nobility, however, were accused of a conspiracy of silence. Livy himself records the darker rumor that the patricians, tired of Romulus's increasingly autocratic style, tore him limb from limb in the Senate house and smuggled the pieces out under their togas. The storm was a cover story. If this is true, and the pervasive, centuries-long distrust between the Roman Senate and any powerful executive suggests a collective memory of this regicide, then the first conspiracy of Rome was a successful assassination and cover-up executed by the very men who would later claim to be the defenders of republican liberty. The Tarquin rape case, a conspiracy to overthrow a king. The second major conspiracy of early Rome is the one that supposedly birthed the Republic, the rape of Lucretia by the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, and the subsequent uprising led by Lucius Junius Brutus. The official narrative is one of outrage. Lucretia, a noblewoman, was raped by Sextus. She summoned her husband and Brutus, made them swear vengeance, and then killed herself. Brutus used her body to incite the populace, overthrew the monarchy, and established the Republic. But even in antiquity, there was a persistent conspiracy theory that the rape of Lucretia was a pretext, a casus belli manufactured by a cabal of disgruntled aristocrats who had already decided to overthrow the king, Tarquin the Proud. The conspiracy theory suggests that Lucretia was either a willing participant whose affair was exposed, or a pawn who was manipulated into suicide to provide a righteous cause. The evidence for this theory lies in the aftermath. Brutus, the leader of the rebellion, was the king's nephew. His own brother had been executed by Tarquin. This was personal. Furthermore, Brutus's first act as one of the first two consuls was to execute his own sons for conspiring to restore the monarchy. This has been interpreted by some historians not as a display of republican virtue, but as a cover-up. Were his sons killed because they knew the truth about the conspiracy against Tarquin? That the revolution was merely a power grab by one faction of the aristocracy against another? The final piece of this puzzle is the curious case of the Sibylline books. Tarquin had purchased these prophetic texts from a Sibyl and guarded them as a state secret. After his overthrow, the new republic kept the books. The conspiracy theory: the overthrow of Tarquin was not just a political revolution, but a theological coup. The new patrician class wanted to control the narrative with the gods, and they needed the books to do it. The rape of Lucretia was the perfect, emotionally resonant story to justify what was, in reality, a cynical transfer of power from a king to an oligarchy. The Coriolanus affair, the conspiracy of the plebs. As the Republic solidified, class warfare became the engine of conspiracy. The story of Gaius Marcius Coriolanus is one of the earliest examples of a conspiracy theory weaponized by the masses. Coriolanus was a legendary general who despised the plebeian class. He proposed that the granting of grain to the poor be contingent on the abolition of the plebeian tribunate, their only political protection. For this, he was put on trial. He refused to bend, was exiled, and famously marched on Rome with an army of the Volsci, only turning back at the tearful pleas of his mother and wife. The conspiracy theory, which circulated among the lower classes for generations, was that Coriolanus was never a real threat. They believed the entire affair was a stage drama orchestrated by the patricians to frighten the plebeians into submission. The theory goes, the patricians let Coriolanus be exiled, knowing he would defect. They then used his subsequent attack to panic the plebeians into abandoning their newly won political rights in exchange for security. The dramatic intervention of his mother was a convenient narrative to allow the patricians to mercifully end the crisis without actually having to fight, having achieved their goal of weakening the plebeian movement. While the story is semi-mythical, the pattern of a foreign threat being used to quash internal dissent became a recurring theme in Roman history, from the Catiline conspiracy to the rule of the emperors. The Republic of Shadows, conspiracies in the Age of Grain and Glory. The Middle and Late Republic saw Rome expand from a regional power to a Mediterranean empire. With this expansion came unimaginable wealth, a vast gap between rich and poor, and a political system that was increasingly paralyzed by factional violence. Conspiracies were no longer the stuff of legend. They were documented, bloody, and frequent. The Bacchanalian Conspiracy 186 BCE, the first state-sponsored moral panic. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate uncovered what it claimed was a vast, international conspiracy to overthrow the state. The conspirators, the worshippers of Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy. The official story, preserved in the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, a surviving bronze inscription detailing the Senate's decree, is one of horror. The cult, it was said, had spread like a plague from Greece into Italy. Under the cover of night, its members, men and women alike, engaged in orgies, forgery, perjury, and murder. The leader of the cult, a Campanian priest, was accused of using the secret society to build a parallel army of initiates who were bound by oaths of loyalty stronger than those to Rome. The Senate responded with a brutal crackdown, executing thousands and strictly regulating the cult. For centuries, this was seen as a necessary purge of a dangerous, libertine death cult. But the conspiracy theory, one that has been validated by modern historians, is that the Bacchanalian conspiracy was a total fabrication, a moral panic engineered by the Senate to consolidate power and destroy a rival center of authority. Here's why this theory holds water. First, the Bacchic cult was popular among the lower classes, women, and freedmen, precisely the people the conservative Senate feared. It provided social cohesion and economic mutual aid outside the patronage system of the nobility. Second, the conspiracy was uncovered by a slave and a prostitute, individuals the Senate would consider unreliable, yet their testimony was taken as gospel. Third, the crackdown allowed the Senate to pass sweeping legislation that gave them unprecedented power to investigate, arrest, and execute without trial, powers that violated the very ius provocationis right of appeal that was the bedrock of Roman liberty. Modern scholarship largely agrees, there was no plot to overthrow the state. The Bacchic cult was a rival social structure. The conspiracy was a conspiracy of the Senate to crush it, using fear-mongering and state-sponsored terror to eliminate a threat to their authority. It was the first great Roman cover-up, and it worked. The grain of truth, the Gracchi and the conspiracy of the oligarchy. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus are among the most famous figures in Roman history. Their attempts at land reform in the 130s and 120s BC led to their deaths and are often cited as the beginning of the fall of the Republic. The official story is that they were dangerous populace who broke with constitutional norms, leading the Senate to take extraordinary measures to preserve the Republic. But the conspiracy theory, which was openly voiced by their supporters at the time and is now the consensus among modern historians, is that the Gracchi were murdered by a conspiracy of the wealthy landowning class who were illegally occupying public land ager publicus. The Tiberius Gracchus conspiracy is the most damning. Tiberius was a tribune of the plebs, a position that was supposed to be sacrosanct. When he proposed redistributing public land to the poor, the Senate, led by his cousin Scipio Nasica, did not wait for a vote. Nasica gathered a mob of senators and their clients, grabbed a piece of a broken bench as a weapon, and led a lynching. Tiberius was clubbed to death on the Capitol, along with hundreds of his supporters. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. The conspiracy was not a secret. It was done in broad daylight. But the cover-up was in the narrative. The Senate claimed they had acted to prevent tyranny. But the sacrosanctity of a tribune had been violated, a sacrosanctity the Senate itself had established. The killing of Tiberius was not a defense of the Constitution, it was the assassination of an elected official by a rival branch of government because he threatened their economic interests. Gaius Gracchus, Tiberius's brother, met a similar fate a decade later. This time, the Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree, for the first time. This was a resolution that gave the consuls absolute power to see to it that the Republic came to no harm. In effect, it was a legal fig leaf for a conspiracy to assassinate a political enemy. The consul Opimius raised a force of senators and their retainers, many of them armed with foreign mercenaries, and massacred Gaius and his followers. They then set up a tribunal that systematically executed his remaining supporters, confiscating their property and even celebrating a festival of public safety. The conspiracy was not the Gracchi's plot. The conspiracy was the Senate's, a self-interested cabal that used its own bodies to murder its way out of reform. The establishment of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum formalized this conspiracy, making it a precedent for the next century of civil war. The Catiline Conspiracy 63 BCE, the conspiracy we know about because Cicero told us. The Catiline Conspiracy is the most famous conspiracy of the Roman Republic, largely because we have the entire prosecutorial case against it, penned by the master orator himself, Marcus Tullius Cicero. The official story, Lucius Sergius Catilina Catiline, a disgraced patrician, plotted with a cabal of debt-ridden aristocrats and disaffected veterans to assassinate the consuls, burn Rome, and seize power. Cicero, as consul, uncovered the plot, delivered a series of fiery speeches in the Senate, and had the conspirators executed without trial. For 2,000 years, this was the accepted narrative. But the conspiracy theory, one that has gained significant traction since the 19th century, is that Catiline was a scapegoat, and Cicero either exaggerated a minor plot or manufactured it entirely to cement his own power and destroy his political rivals. Let's look at the evidence for the counter-conspiracy. First, Cicero's primary evidence came from informants and intercepted letters. The letters, according to Cicero's own account, were unsealed by the Senate in a move that was of questionable legality. Second, the Senate's execution of the conspirators, Roman citizens, without trial was a gross violation of law. Julius Caesar, then a young senator, argued passionately against it, warning that it would set a precedent for tyranny. He was shouted down. Third, the aftermath benefited Cicero enormously. He was hailed as Pater Patri, father of the fatherland. His political enemies, many of whom were allied with Catiline or his co-conspirator, Caesar, were marginalized. Fourth, Catiline's platform was not inherently tyrannical. He ran on a platform of debt cancellation, a populist message that terrified the creditor class that dominated the Senate. The conspiracy theory suggests that Catiline was a genuine political reformer. The plot was either a disorganized meeting of disgruntled nobles that Cicero blew out of proportion, or a deliberate provocation by Cicero to goad Catiline into fleeing so that he could then destroy his followers. The executions were a political massacre, not a necessary act of national security. In this reading, the Catiline conspiracy was a conspiracy by Cicero and the Optimates to eliminate the populist movement that had been growing since the Gracchi. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. Catiline probably did conspire to use violence to gain power. That was the standard operating procedure of the late Republic. But the narrative that has survived is not history, it is a political brief. The fact that we know Catiline as a villain is a testament to the success of Cicero's centuries-long propaganda campaign. The First Triumvirate, the conspiracy that ate the Republic. The First Triumvirate was not a conspiracy in the sense of a secret plot. It was a secret alliance. In 60 BC, three men, Gaius Julius Caesar, the wealthy general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus Pompey, and the richest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus, formed a private pact to subvert the Republic. They agreed to use their combined wealth, military power, and political influence to control the government, dividing the provinces and legions among themselves. This was an open secret, but it was a conspiracy nonetheless. The Optimates in the Senate knew something was wrong, but they couldn't prove the collusion. The triumvirate rigged elections, passed laws that benefited each other, and used violence and bribery on a scale never before seen. The conspiracy theory surrounding the triumvirate is not about whether it existed. It's about whether the Republic was already so corrupt and dysfunctional that the triumvirate was merely the logical conclusion of a century of oligarchic conspiracy. In this view, the Senate had spent decades using the senatus consultum ultimum, bribery, and political murder to maintain control. The triumvirate was simply the first time the ambitious generals decided to stop playing by the Senate's rules and make their own. The death of Crassus in 53 BCE and the death of Julius Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife dissolved the family ties holding the alliance together. The conspiracy then mutated into a civil war, with Pompey and the Senate conspiring to strip Caesar of his command and bring him to trial. Caesar's response, crossing the Rubicon with a legion, was the final act. The conspiracy of the few had led to the destruction of the system. The imperial hoax, conspiracies at the heart of empire. The transition from republic to principate the empire did not end conspiracies, it perfected them. Under the emperors, conspiracy became a way of life. The emperor was a singularity of power, and the only way to change policy or remove a tyrant was through assassination and usurpation. The imperial period is a catalogue of conspiracies, many of which we know only through the lens of the winners. The Augustan settlement, the greatest conspiracy in history. Octavian, later Augustus, emerged from the civil wars as the sole master of Rome. His restoration of the Republic in 27 BCE is considered one of the most brilliant political maneuvers in history. He claimed to hand back all power to the Senate and the people. In return, they gave him control of the key provinces, the title of Augustus the Revered One, and the tribunicia potestas, the power of a tribune. He was not a king, he was the princeps, the first citizen. This is the official story. The conspiracy theory, one that is now mainstream historical interpretation, is that the Augustan settlement was a complete fiction, a meticulously crafted conspiracy to establish a hereditary monarchy while maintaining the illusion of a republic. The evidence for this massive cover-up is everywhere. Augustus controlled the legions. He controlled Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire. He held the treasury. He appointed his friends to key positions. He created a new bureaucracy that answered only to him. The Senate became a glorified city council, its members handpicked by Augustus. But the most damning evidence of the conspiracy is cultural. Augustus launched a massive propaganda campaign. He commissioned Virgil to write the Aeneid, an epic that linked his family the Julians to the Trojan hero Aeneas, giving him divine ancestry. He commissioned Livy to write a history of Rome that glorified the Republic while subtly justifying the need for a strong leader. He built the altar of peace Ara Pacis to celebrate his new order. He reformed morality laws, positioning himself as the restorer of traditional virtue. This was not just governance, it was a total rebranding of reality. The Republic was dead. What replaced it was an autocracy. But the conspiracy was so successful that for centuries, people believed Augustus had saved the Republic. The reality, that he had methodically, bloodlessly after action dismantled it and replaced it with a system that was more efficient but fundamentally undemocratic, was the conspiracy that held for over 400 years. The Julio-Claudian playbook, poison, praetorians, and propaganda. The emperors who followed Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, are often depicted as a parade of degeneracy. Their stories are filled with poisonings, incest, matricide, and madness. But the conspiracy theory that has emerged from a critical reading of sources like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio is that the Julio-Claudian dynasty was not a collection of madmen, but a series of victims of a sustained conspiracy by the senatorial class to delegitimize the imperial system. The senators hated the emperors because the emperors had taken their power. The histories we have were written by senators. Therefore, we have to read them with the understanding that they are, in effect, conspiracy theories written by the losers about the winners. Take Tiberius. The official story: a paranoid recluse who retired to Capri to commit unspeakable acts of depravity while allowing his sinister Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, to run a reign of terror in Rome. The conspiracy theory: Tiberius was a competent, if dour, administrator who grew tired of the senatorial intrigue in Rome. He left the day-to-day governance to Sejanus, who then did conspire against him. When Tiberius discovered Sejanus's plot, he had him executed. The stories of Capri were likely posthumous propaganda spread by senators who despised him for his efficiency in prosecuting them for corruption. Take Caligula. The official story: a madman who made his horse a consul, who tried to fight the sea, who committed incest with his sisters. The conspiracy theory: Caligula was a young, popular emperor who was assassinated by a conspiracy of Praetorian guards and senators after a short reign. The madness was a narrative constructed to justify his murder. Many of his insane acts, like building a bridge of boats, were logistical exercises or religious acts that were later twisted. The horse story is almost certainly a joke that got out of hand, used to imply he was mocking the Senate. Take Claudius. The official story: a stuttering, drooling fool who was made emperor by accident and was dominated by his wives and freedmen. The conspiracy theory: Claudius was a highly intelligent scholar and a capable administrator who expanded the empire and centralized the imperial bureaucracy. The full narrative was pushed by the senatorial class, who despised him because he used freedmen, former slaves, as his ministers instead of them. His death by poison, by his wife Agrippina to promote her son Nero, is one of the few conspiracies that is almost universally accepted as true. Take Nero. The official story: a tyrannical artist who fiddled while Rome burned, who kicked his pregnant wife to death, who was a monster. The conspiracy theory: Nero was a populist emperor beloved by the common people and the eastern provinces, who was systematically undermined by the Senate. The Great Fire of Rome? Modern archaeology and historical analysis suggest it was an accident. The fiddling is anachronistic. The fiddle didn't exist. His persecution of Christians was a way to deflect blame for the fire, but the idea that he started the fire is a conspiracy theory concocted by his enemies. His downfall came not because he was a tyrant, but because a conspiracy of provincial governors and senators finally managed to turn the military against him. The Julio-Claudian dynasty collapsed under Nero, but the pattern was set. For the next 2 centuries, the Roman Empire would be defined by a perpetual conspiracy: the emperor against the Senate against the emperor, and the Praetorian Guard against both. The year of the 4 emperors, 69 CE, the conspiracy of the legions. After Nero's fall, the Roman world discovered a terrifying truth: emperors could be made outside Rome. The year 69 CE saw 4 emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, rise and fall in rapid succession. The official narrative is one of chaos. But the conspiracy theory that lurks beneath the surface is that the year of the 4 emperors was not a chaotic accident, but a deliberate demonstration of a new principle. The empire was not a sacred office, but a prize to be seized by the strongest general. The conspiracy was not a secret, it was a systemic revelation. The key figure is Galba. He was proclaimed emperor by the legions in Hispania. When he marched on Rome, he did not bring money to pay the Praetorian Guard. The Guard, who had grown accustomed to a hefty bribe from each new emperor, felt betrayed. They conspired with Otho, a disgruntled noble, to assassinate Galba. This was the first time the Guard openly marketed the emperorship. The conspiracy then spiraled. The legions in Germany proclaimed Vitellius. The legions in the east proclaimed Vespasian. The civil war that followed was not a series of spontaneous revolts. It was the result of a network of commanders who had realized that the Pax was a lie. The Flavian dynasty Vespasian and his sons that emerged from the chaos was built on the understanding that the emperor's power derived from the legions, not the Senate. The conspiracy that was validated in 69 CE was the one the triumvirate had hinted at. The Republic was dead, and the empire was, at its core, a military dictatorship dressed in republican robes. The Senate no longer even played a role in the selection process. They merely ratified the choice of the armies. The Domitianic Terror, a conspiracy of silence. Emperor Domitian 81–96 CE is one of the most maligned figures in Roman history. The official story, written by senators like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, is that he was a paranoid tyrant who instituted a reign of terror, executing senators, exiling philosophers, and declaring himself Lord and God. He was assassinated in a palace conspiracy, and the Senate gleefully passed a damnatio memoriae, a decree that his name be erased from public monuments. The conspiracy theory, one that has gained significant support from modern historians who have looked beyond the senatorial sources, is that Domitian was a capable, authoritarian administrator who was murdered by a conspiracy of his own courtiers, and the senatorial reign of terror was a fabrication to justify the coup that brought the more pliant Emperor Nerva to power. Consider the evidence. Domitian's building projects, his fortification of the frontiers, his stabilization of the currency, these are not the acts of a madman. His crime, in the eyes of the Senate, was that he treated them as subordinates, not partners. He acted like a king. The reign of terror involved the execution of a few senators for actual corruption or treason, which was no different than what his father, Vespasian, had done. But because the senators who wrote the history were the ones who had been humiliated, they painted him as a monster. The assassination itself was a conspiracy involving his wife, Domitia, and his own praetorian prefect. They likely killed him because he was planning to execute them for their own conspiracies. After his death, the conspirators needed to justify their act. They turned to the Senate, which eagerly erased Domitian's memory. The damnatio memoriae was the final act of the conspiracy, an attempt to rewrite history so completely that Domitian would be remembered not as a competent emperor who clashed with the aristocracy, but as a crazed despot. It almost worked. For nearly 1,900 years, Domitian was remembered as one of the worst emperors. Only modern archaeology and a critical rereading of the biased sources have begun to restore his reputation. The crisis of the 3rd century, conspiracy as a system. The 3rd century CE was a period of near-total collapse. From 235 to 284, over 50 men were acclaimed as emperor, most dying violently. The empire was beset by plague, invasion, economic depression, and civil war. In this environment, conspiracy was no longer an exception, it was the primary mechanism of political change. The Severan dynasty, the conspiracy of the matriarchs. The Severan dynasty 193 to 235 was founded by Septimio Severus, a general from Africa who seized power after the assassination of Commodus and the chaotic year of the 5 emperors. The dynasty is unique because the real power behind the throne was often not the emperor, but the women, Julia Domna, Julia Maesa, Julia Soaemias, and Julia Mamaea. The official story is that these women were powerful regents and advisors. The conspiracy theory, which is supported by contemporary sources, is that they were the architects of a long-term plot to control the empire through a series of weak, malleable male figureheads. Consider the rise of Elagabalus 218 to 222. Elagabalus was a teenage priest of a sun god from Syria. He was made emperor by his grandmother, Julia Maesa, who spread a rumor that he was the illegitimate son of the previous emperor, Caracalla. She then led a revolt of the legions in Syria, overthrew the reigning emperor Macrinus, and installed her grandson. Elagabalus was a puppet. When he proved too erratic, Maesa and her other daughter, Julia Soaemias, conspired to replace him with his cousin, Severus Alexander. Severus Alexander's reign was dominated by his mother, Julia Mamaea, who essentially ran the empire. She was so controlling that the legions eventually mutinied, killed both her and her son, and installed a barracks emperor, Maximinus Thrax. The conspiracy theory of the Severan matriarchs is that they viewed the empire as a family business. They used the military, propaganda, and murder to keep a Syrophoenician dynasty on the throne for 42 years, a remarkable feat in the chaos of the 3rd century. They were the unseen puppet masters, and the history of the period is largely the history of their conspiracies. The 30 Tyrants, the conspiracy of the generals. The period from 235 to 284 is often called the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a time when the empire fractured into 3 competing states: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the Central Roman Empire in Italy. The official narrative is one of collapse due to external pressures. But the conspiracy theory, one that explains the period's bizarre dynamics, is that the fragmentation was not a collapse, but a deliberate, if desperate, strategy by a network of military commanders to save the empire. The conspiracy was a tacit agreement among the generals to stop fighting each other for a single throne and instead consolidate their local defenses. Look at Postumus, who declared the Gallic Empire in 260. He did not march on Rome. He set up his own senate, his own consuls, and his own Praetorian Guard, and he successfully defended Gaul, Britain, and Hispania for a decade. Similarly, in the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra carved out a massive kingdom that included Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia. She did not initially seek to destroy Rome. She was a Roman ally who took advantage of the power vacuum to secure the eastern frontier against Persia. The conspiracy theory suggests that these were not rebellions in the traditional sense. They were pragmatic responses to the failure of the central government to provide security. The generals and rulers were, in a sense, conspiring to keep the empire alive by letting it die and be reborn in more manageable pieces. It was only when a series of capable, military-minded emperors, Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian, Probus, emerged that the pieces were forcibly reunited. Aurelian, the restorer of the world, understood this dynamic. He conquered the Gallic and Palmyrene empires, reunifying the state. But his assassination in 275, allegedly by his own secretaries who feared his discipline, shows how even successful emperors were victims of the conspiratorial culture. The Tetrarchy, the conspiracy to end conspiracies. Emperor Diocletian 284–305 understood that the root cause of the 3rd century chaos was the lack of a clear succession. Emperors were made by the armies, which led to constant civil war. His solution was the Tetrarchy, or rule of 4. Diocletian divided the empire into 2 halves, east and west, each ruled by an Augustus senior emperor. Each Augustus then appointed a Caesar junior emperor and successor. The system was designed to eliminate the need for conspiracy. Succession would be orderly. The emperors would be chosen on merit, not birth or military acclamation. This was a grand conspiracy to redesign the fundamental structure of Roman power. And for a time, it worked. The Tetrarchy brought stability. But the conspiracy theory surrounding the Tetrarchy is that it was never a genuine reform. It was a power-sharing agreement among a small group of ruthless Illyrian generals who had no intention of giving up power. The proof of this is what happened when Diocletian, the mastermind, voluntarily retired in 305 and forced his co-Augustus, Maximian, to do the same. The Tetrarchy collapsed almost immediately. The Caesars, Constantius Chlorus and Galerius, became Augusti, but their successors were not appointed as planned. The son of Constantius, Constantine, was passed over. The son of Maximian, Maxentius, was passed over. What followed was a new round of civil wars, culminating in Constantine's victory at the Milvian Bridge in 312. The conspiracy that had held the Tetrarchy together was the personal authority of Diocletian. Once he was gone, the old dynamics of ambition, heredity, and military power reasserted themselves. The Tetrarchy was less a solution than a temporary truce, a conspiracy that couldn't outlast its creator. The Christian conspiracy, the rewriting of reality. Perhaps the greatest and most enduring conspiracy in Roman history is not about who killed whom, but about how the very soul of the empire was transformed. The rise of Christianity from a persecuted sect to the official state religion is a story filled with cover-ups, forgeries, and political maneuvering. The Great Fire of 64 CE, the first Christian conspiracy theory. As mentioned earlier, the Great Fire of Rome under Nero is a conspiracy theory that has been debated for 2 millennia. The official story, as told by Tacitus, is that Nero scapegoated the Christians to deflect rumors that he himself had started the fire. But there is a deeper conspiracy theory, one that was promoted by later Christian writers, that the fire was actually started by Christians. This theory posits that early Christian apocalyptic sects, believing that the destruction of Rome was necessary for the second coming of Christ, deliberately set the fire to hasten the end times. Nero's persecution, in this reading, was not a scapegoating but a legitimate response to an act of terror. This theory is largely discredited by modern historians, but it reveals a key dynamic. The history of early Christianity is a history of conspiracy theories, both for and against. The idea that Christians were a secret society with a hidden agenda, cannibalism misunderstanding the Eucharist, incest misunderstanding love feasts, and disloyalty to the emperor refusing to worship the state gods, persisted for centuries. These were the conspiracy theories of the pagan Roman state. And while they were wildly inaccurate in their specifics, they were correct in one crucial way. The Christians were conspiring to replace the old gods with a new one. The Diocletianic persecution, the conspiracy of the Tetrarchs. Diocletian, the great stabilizer, launched the last and most severe persecution of Christians in 303 CE. The official reason was to restore the traditional Roman religion and ensure the favor of the gods. The conspiracy theory, one that is supported by the political context, is that the persecution was a tool to unify the fracturing Tetrarchy. By 303, the Tetrarchy was under strain. Diocletian was aging. His co-emperor, Galerius, was an ambitious hardliner who despised the Christians and saw them as a fifth column for Persia. Galerius pushed for the persecution, likely as a way to test Diocletian's authority and to create a common enemy that would bind the 4 emperors together. The persecution was brutally enforced in the east under Galerius but largely ignored in the west under Constantius Chlorus, the father of Constantine. This inconsistency suggests that the conspiracy to persecute was not a united policy. It was a political gambit that backfired, contributing to the instability that followed Diocletian's abdication. The persecution created martyrs, and those martyrs became the foundation of Christian political power in the next generation. The donation of Constantine, the forgery that shaped the world. In the 8th century, a document emerged that would shape the politics of Europe for over 700 years. Called the Donation of Constantine, it purported to be a decree from the 4th century Emperor Constantine the Great. In it, Constantine granted to Pope Sylvester I and all his successors dominion over Rome, Italy, and all the western provinces. It claimed that Constantine gave the Pope the imperial crown, the imperial palace, and the authority of the emperor in the west. This document was used by the papacy to assert its temporal power over European kings. For centuries, it was accepted as genuine. But it was, in fact, one of the most successful and consequential forgeries in history, a conspiracy that rewrote the history of the Roman Empire's transition to Christianity. The conspiracy theory behind the donation is simple. A forgery was created in the papal chancellery in the mid-8th century to legitimize the Pope's new political role. The Roman Empire had withdrawn from the West, and the Pope was forming alliances with the Franks. The donation gave this new political arrangement an ancient, unimpeachable pedigree. The forgery was not exposed until the 15th century, when the humanist Lorenzo Valla proved it was a fake using philological analysis. He showed that the language used in the document was not 4th century Latin but 8th century. The conspiracy had worked for centuries, shaping the entire structure of medieval Christendom. It was, in effect, a Roman conspiracy, albeit a medieval one, that used the legacy of Rome to create a new empire. The death of Hypatia, the conspiracy of the Church. In 415 CE, in Alexandria, the philosopher and mathematician Hypatia was brutally murdered by a mob of Christian monks. She was dragged from her chariot, stripped, killed with roofing tiles, and her body was dismembered and burned. The official story, recorded by the Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, is that she was a victim of a political feud between the prefect Orestes and the bishop Cyril of Alexandria. The conspiracy theory, one that has become central to modern critiques of the Christianization of the empire, is that Hypatia's murder was not a spontaneous riot but a deliberate act of political assassination ordered by Bishop Cyril to eliminate a powerful, influential pagan who was a friend of the prefect. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Cyril had been in a power struggle with Orestes. Hypatia was a respected intellectual and advisor to Orestes. Her murder effectively ended Orestes' political opposition. Furthermore, Cyril was later canonized as a saint. The contemporary sources that condemned the murder were largely silenced. This was a conspiracy of the Church to consolidate its power in Alexandria, one of the intellectual capitals of the ancient world. The murder of Hypatia marked the end of classical paganism as an organized intellectual force. The conspiracy to replace the rational, philosophical traditions of the Hellenistic world with a unified Christian dogma was nearly complete. The Fall and the Forgery, conspiracies at the end of the empire. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE is one of the most debated events in history. Was it a gradual transformation or a violent collapse? The conspiracies surrounding this period are about who gets the blame. The Battle of Frigidus 394 CE, the conspiracy to kill paganism. The Battle of Frigidus was fought between the Christian Emperor Theodosius I and the pagan usurper Eugenius. Theodosius won, and the victory is often cited as the final triumph of Christianity over paganism in the West. The conspiracy theory surrounding this battle is that it was not a fair fight. Theodosius had allied with the Gothic chieftain Alaric, using barbarian troops to defeat a Roman army. In the aftermath, Theodosius consolidated power and issued a series of decrees that made Nicene Christianity the only legal religion. Pagan temples were destroyed, the Vestal Virgins were disbanded, and the Olympian Games were abolished. The theory suggests that the battle was the culmination of a long-term conspiracy by the Christian Church to use the power of the state to destroy paganism. Theodosius was a tool of the Church, particularly the powerful Bishop Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose had already forced Theodosius to do public penance for a massacre in Thessalonica. At Frigidus, Ambrose was effectively the power behind the throne, using the emperor to eliminate the last bastions of pagan political power. The conspiracy was the merging of church and state into a single, totalitarian entity that would tolerate no rivals. The sack of Rome 410 CE, pagan conspiracy or Christian failure? When Alaric the Visigoth sacked Rome in 410 CE, it was a psychological blow from which the Western Empire never recovered. For the pagan Romans who remained, there was an obvious explanation. The gods had abandoned Rome because the city had abandoned them. This gave rise to a conspiracy theory that the sack was divine punishment for the Christian emperors who had neglected the traditional cults. Saint Augustine of Hippo wrote The City of God in response, a massive work that argued that the earthly city was not the focus of God's plan, thereby deflecting the blame. But there was another conspiracy theory, that the sack was facilitated by treason within the Roman elite? Did Alaric's success come because Roman senators, hoping to curry favor with the Goths, opened the gates? Was there a conspiracy to overthrow Emperor Honorius, who had been hiding in the impregnable fortress of Ravenna, leaving Rome to its fate? The historian Zosimus, writing a century later, pushed the narrative that the Christian prohibition of the old rites had weakened the empire and that the barbarian invasions were a consequence of this religious conspiracy. In this view, the sack was not a random act of war, it was the result of a self-inflicted wound, a conspiracy of Christian bishops to undermine the traditional Roman military spirit. While this view was rejected by the Christian establishment, it persisted for centuries as a pagan conspiracy theory against the Christian state. The last conspiracy, the end of the West 476 CE. The traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 CE, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern emperor Zeno, declaring that the West no longer needed its own emperor. The official story is one of conquest. But the conspiracy theory, one that is now taken seriously by historians, is that the fall was not a sudden event but a managed transition. Odoacer was a Roman military commander, the Magister Militum, who was requested by the remnants of the Roman Senate to depose a usurper and govern in the name of the Eastern Emperor. The barbarian conquest was, in effect, a coup orchestrated by the Roman aristocracy to replace an ineffective puppet Romulus Augustulus with a more effective one, Odoacer. The conspiracy theory extends to the famous damnatio memoriae of the Western Empire. The Eastern Emperor Zeno tacitly accepted the situation. Why? Because he was engaged in his own conspiracies back in Constantinople. The fall was a political solution to a military problem, dressed up as a cataclysm. For the average Roman in Italy, life continued much as it had, only with a new landlord. This final conspiracy, the rewriting of a political transition as a civilization-ending apocalypse, was the last great act of Roman historical spin. It created the narrative of the Dark Ages that followed, a narrative that served the interests of both the new Germanic kingdoms who claimed to have conquered Rome and the Eastern Empire who claimed to be the sole, undiminished Roman power. Rome fell. But the conspiracies did not. They were inherited, reproposed, and reimagined. The idea of a hidden cabal controlling world events, the Shadow Empire, finds its prototype in the Roman Senate's manipulation of the Bacchanalians, or the Augustan settlement's concealment of monarchy. The tradition of rewriting history through propaganda, from Cicero's Catiline orations to the Damnatio Memoriae of Domitian, set the standard for political spin for 2 millennia. What the study of these Roman conspiracies teaches us is that the truth is rarely found in the official narrative. The marble facade of Roman history, the Pax Romana, the Virtus Senate, the mad emperors, was often a constructed reality designed to serve the interests of the ruling class. When archaeologists excavate a mass grave of Catiline's followers, or a tomb of a barbarian king buried with Roman regalia, or a set of forgeries in a papal archive, they are not finding alternative history. They are finding the real history that the conspiracy sought to hide. Ancient Rome was not a civilization of toga-clad philosophers calmly debating in the forum. It was a fever swamp of intrigue, where power was taken, held, and lost through a constant, unending series of conspiracies. And the greatest conspiracy of all was the one that convinced the world that it was something else. The echoes in the marble are not echoes of virtue or glory. They are the whispers of the conspirators, the men and women in the shadows who knew that the empire was not a monument to destiny, but a prize to be seized. And in the end, the conspiracy survived, even when the empire did not. The Eastern Web, Conspiracies of the Byzantine Empire. The Western Roman Empire may have fallen in 476 CE, but the Roman Empire did not end. It continued in the East, centered on the city of Constantinople. For another 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire, as modern historians call it, preserved Roman law, Roman governance, and Roman paranoia. If anything, the conspiracies of the Eastern Empire were more elaborate, more theological, and often more lethal than anything the West had produced. Here, the stakes were not just political power but the very soul of Christendom. The foundation of Constantinople, the conspiracy of the New Rome. In 324 CE, Emperor Constantine the Great stood on the shores of the Bosphorus, tracing the boundaries of a new city with his spear. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome. The world would come to know it as Constantinople. The official story is that Constantine founded the city to create a Christian capital, a new center of power free from the pagan traditions of old Rome. The conspiracy theory, one that is supported by the geopolitical realities of the time, is that Constantine was not building a new Rome to rival the old. He was building a fortress from which to escape the conspiracies of the old. Old Rome was a city of senatorial families who still harbored pagan sympathies, who still whispered against the upstart emperor who had turned his back on Jupiter. Constantine had spent years fighting civil wars, against Maxentius, against Licinius. He had seen how the Roman aristocracy could foment rebellion. He needed a capital where he controlled the levers of power absolutely, where the Senate was a creature of his will, not a hereditary cabal of ancient families. The deeper conspiracy theory involves the location itself. Byzantium, the Greek city that preceded Constantinople, was strategically located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It was a hub of trade, a military choke point, and, crucially, far from the Rhine and Danube frontiers where usurpers traditionally arose. By moving the capital, Constantine was not just founding a city, he was orchestrating a slow, deliberate transfer of power from the old senatorial class to a new class of bureaucrats and military men who owed everything to him. But there was an even darker layer to this conspiracy. Constantine brought with him to Constantinople the Palladium, the ancient wooden statue of Athena that was said to protect Rome. He also brought the relics of the apostles and the true cross. This was not a simple transfer of objects, it was a theft of sacred power. Constantine was systematically dismantling the spiritual infrastructure of old Rome and reassembling it in his new city. The conspiracy was to make Constantinople not just the political capital of the Roman world, but its spiritual heart. And it worked. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople was seen as the divinely protected city, the New Jerusalem, while old Rome faded into medieval obscurity. The final piece of this conspiracy is the matter of Constantine's death. On his deathbed in 337, he was baptized by the Arian bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, not by the Orthodox bishop of Rome. This was a scandal that the church later tried to obscure. The conspiracy theory, Constantine was never truly a Nicene Christian. He was a political pragmatist who used Christianity as a tool of unification. His deathbed baptism was performed by a heretic, and the subsequent rewriting of his life by Orthodox historians, most notably Eusebius of Caesarea, was a massive cover-up to present him as a saintly, Orthodox emperor. The donation of Constantine, discussed earlier, was merely the most famous of many forgeries that sought to control his legacy. The Arian conspiracy, the heresy that nearly destroyed the empire. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is presented as the moment when the Church united to condemn the heresy of Arianism, the belief that Christ was a created being, not co-eternal with God the Father. The official story: the bishops gathered, debated, and under Constantine's guidance, produced the Nicene Creed, which settled the matter once and for all. The conspiracy theory, one that is now understood by every serious historian of the period, is that the Council of Nicaea was not a conclusion but the opening salvo in a century-long conspiracy war that nearly tore the Roman Empire apart. Arianism was not a fringe heresy. It was the dominant theology of the Eastern Empire for generations, supported by emperors, bishops, and the vast majority of the population in the East. The conspiracy began with Eusebius of Nicomedia, the bishop who baptized Constantine. He was an Arian, and he used his influence to pack the imperial court with Arian sympathizers. After Constantine's death, his sons, Constantius II in the East, were openly Arian. What followed was a period of relentless intrigue. Orthodox bishops were deposed, exiled, and sometimes murdered. Athanasius of Alexandria, the great defender of Nicene orthodoxy, was exiled 5 times. He spent 17 of his 45 years as bishop in exile, fleeing from imperial officials sent to arrest him. The conspiracy theory here is that the Roman state, from the 330s to the 380s, was effectively controlled by an Arian cabal that used the machinery of empire to suppress Nicene Christianity. This was not a theological debate, it was a political struggle dressed in theological robes. Emperors were crowned and deposed based on their religious affiliations. Bishops were appointed by imperial decree. The conspiracy was so successful that by the 360s, the Emperor Valens and Arian openly persecuted the Orthodox, and the future of Nicene Christianity hung by a thread. The turning point came in 378 at the Battle of Adrianople, where Valens was killed by the Goths. His successor, Theodosius I, was a Nicene Christian from Hispania. He immediately issued the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, making Nicene Christianity the official state religion. The conspiracy had finally been defeated, or had it? The Arian Goths who settled within the empire would carry their version of Christianity into the West, creating a religious divide that would persist for centuries. What this chapter reveals is that the official history of Christianity as a unified, orthodox religion from the time of Constantine is a fiction. It was the result of a century of political warfare, with the state acting as the enforcer for one faction against another. The Nicene Creed we recite today was not the inevitable triumph of truth over heresy, it was the victory of one conspiracy over another. The conspiracy of John Chrysostom, the Golden Mouth silenced. John Chrysostom, Golden Mouth, was the greatest preacher of the early church. He served as Patriarch of Constantinople from 398 to 404. He was a reformer who railed against the corruption of the clergy, the excesses of the wealthy, and the intrigues of the imperial court. He was also, predictably, destroyed by a conspiracy. The official story: John was deposed by a synod of bishops for his harshness and for allegedly harboring heretics. The conspiracy theory: John was the victim of a coordinated plot by the Empress Eudoxia, the Patriarch of Alexandria Theophilus, and a cabal of court officials who feared his influence and hated his moral reforms. Eudoxia was the wife of Emperor Arcadius, a weak ruler dominated by his wife and his ministers. John preached sermons comparing her to Herodias, the woman who demanded the head of John the Baptist. This was not merely an insult, it was a public accusation of tyranny and immorality. Theophilus of Alexandria was a political rival who saw the Patriarchate of Constantinople as a threat to his own authority. He was also a man of immense wealth and political cunning. The conspiracy unfolded with ruthless efficiency. Theophilus traveled to Constantinople with a collection of Egyptian bishops. They convened a synod at a suburban villa called the Oak, which was conveniently located near the imperial palace. The synod was packed with Theophilus's allies. John was summoned, refused to appear before a kangaroo court, and was declared deposed. When the people of Constantinople rioted in support of their beloved bishop, the imperial court backed down temporarily. But Eudoxia was relentless. She engineered a second exile, this time sending John to the remote wilderness of the Caucasus. The final, dark twist in this conspiracy is John's death in 407. He had been forced to march for months in harsh weather, starved, and denied medical care. The conspiracy theory: John was not merely exiled, he was deliberately killed by his enemies. The imperial court issued orders that he be moved to an even more remote location, knowing that the journey would kill him. When he died, his last words were reported to be, "Glory to God for all things." 30 years later, his bones were returned to Constantinople with great ceremony by a later emperor who sought to heal the schism. But the conspiracy had worked. John Chrysostom, the greatest moral voice of his age, was silenced because he dared to speak truth to power. The Nika riots, the conspiracy of the chariot factions. In 532 CE, Constantinople erupted in the most violent urban uprising in Roman history. The Nika riots, named for the chant Nika, conquer, shouted by the rioters, left half the city in ashes and nearly cost Emperor Justinian his throne. The official story: the riots began as a dispute between chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, and spiraled out of control. The conspiracy theory, one that has been explored in depth by modern historians, is that the Nika riots were not a spontaneous sporting riot. They were a coordinated coup attempt, orchestrated by a conspiracy of the old senatorial aristocracy who sought to overthrow Justinian and replace him with a more pliable emperor. To understand this, we must understand the factions. The Blues and Greens were not just sports fans. They were organized political and social groups with their own leaders, their own militias, and their own influence over the imperial government. Justinian himself had risen to power with the support of the Blues. By 532, his reign was marked by high taxes, ruthless financial extraction to fund his wars of reconquest, and the brutal suppression of any dissent. The conspiracy began when several members of both factions were condemned to death for murder. The execution was botched, and the condemned escaped to a church. The factions, normally rivals, united in demanding their pardon. Justinian refused. The mob then took to the streets, chanting Nika, and soon the entire city was in revolt. The key evidence for a senatorial conspiracy comes from the aftermath. When the mob proclaimed Hypatius, a nephew of the former emperor Anastasius, as the new emperor in the Hippodrome, the senatorial families flocked to his side. They saw an opportunity to end Justinian's heavy-handed rule. The conspiracy was not the factions alone, it was the old aristocracy using the mob as a battering ram against an emperor they despised. Justinian's response was legendary. He was prepared to flee. His wife, Theodora, one of the most remarkable figures in Roman history, reportedly gave a speech declaring that purple makes a fine winding sheet. She refused to flee. Instead, she convinced Justinian to stay and fight. The general Belisarius and another commander, Mundus, were sent into the Hippodrome with their troops. They slaughtered the mob, men, women, and children, killing an estimated 30,000 people. Hypatius was executed. The conspiracy theory surrounding the Nika riots is that the entire event was a trap. Some historians suggest that Justinian's agents provocateurs deliberately botched the executions to provoke the uprising, allowing him to crush the senatorial opposition once and for all. Whether the conspiracy was against Justinian or engineered by him, the result was the same. The old Roman aristocracy in Constantinople was broken. Justinian emerged as an absolute ruler, free to pursue his grand projects, including the rebuilding of Hagia Sophia, which still stands today. The Secret History of Procopius, the conspiracy of the historian. Procopius of Caesarea was the official historian of Justinian's reign. He wrote The Wars, a massive work praising the emperor's military campaigns. He wrote The Buildings, a panegyric celebrating Justinian's architectural projects. He was the court historian, the man whose job was to craft the official narrative. And then, there is the secret history. The secret history anecdota is one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from antiquity. In it, Procopius systematically destroys the very people he praised in his official works. He portrays Justinian as a demon, a literal devil who walked the earth wearing a human mask. He describes Theodora as a prostitute of insatiable appetites who performed acts so obscene that Procopius claims he cannot bring himself to describe them. He accuses Belisarius, the great general, of being a cuckold dominated by his treacherous wife. For centuries, scholars debated whether the secret history was genuine. The conspiracy theory, the one that is now the consensus, is that the secret history was not as secret at all. It was a political insurance policy. The theory goes like this. Procopius was a member of the senatorial class. He despised Justinian's autocracy, his low-born origins, and his policies that crushed the aristocracy. But he could not speak openly while Justinian lived. So he wrote the secret history as a hidden record, to be discovered after Justinian's death. He intended it to be the real history, the truth that would restore the reputation of the senatorial class and damn the tyrant forever. But there is an even deeper layer. Some scholars argue that the secret history was not intended to be hidden at all. It was a form of political satire, a way for Procopius to express his rage in a coded form that his contemporaries would understand. In this reading, the secret history was an open secret, a text that circulated among the elite who shared Procopius's hatred of Justinian. It was a conspiracy in ink, a written rebellion against the official narrative that Procopius himself was paid to produce. The secret history survived because it was true enough to be useful and scandalous enough to be fascinating. It was discovered in the Vatican Library in the 17th century and published. It remains the single most damning portrait of a Roman emperor ever written. Whether it is a conspiracy against Justinian or a conspiracy of Procopius's own making, it stands as a monument to the fact that even in an autocracy, the pen can be a weapon. The Monothelite controversy, the conspiracy to unify the church. In the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire was fighting for its survival. The Arab conquests had torn away Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. The empire was reduced to Anatolia, Greece, and Italy. In the face of this existential threat, Emperor Heraclius 610–641 attempted to find a theological formula that would reconcile the Chalcedonian Orthodox who believed Christ had two natures with the Monophysites who believed Christ had one nature who dominated the lost provinces. The official story, Heraclius and Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople proposed the doctrine of monothelitism, the idea that Christ had two natures but one will. This, they believed, would bridge the divide and reunify the Christian East. The conspiracy theory, monothelitism, was a political conspiracy from the start, a desperate attempt by the imperial government to create a state religion that would pacify the conquered provinces and win them back from the Arabs. Theology was merely the tool. The real goal was political unity at any cost. The conspiracy unraveled in spectacular fashion. The popes in Rome rejected monothelitism, seeing it as a surrender to heresy. The Emperor Constans II, grandson of Heraclius, responded with the typos, an edict forbidding anyone from discussing whether Christ had one will or two. This was the ultimate conspiracy, to silence debate itself. The Pope, Martin I, refused to comply. He was arrested, dragged to Constantinople, tried for treason, tortured, and exiled to the Crimea, where he died of starvation. The conspiracy had failed. The Monothelite doctrine was condemned at the Third Council of Constantinople in 680–681. But the deeper conspiracy, the attempt by the imperial government to control theology for political ends, had been exposed. The lesson was clear: the emperor could not dictate doctrine to the church. The schism between East and West, which would culminate in 1054, had its roots in these conspiracies of the 7th century. The iconoclast conspiracy, the war on images. No conspiracy in Byzantine history was more bitter or more destructive than iconoclasm, the movement to destroy religious images. For over a century, from 726 to 843, The empire was torn apart by the question of whether icons were holy objects or idolatry. The official story: Emperor Leo III began the movement in 726, believing that the empire's military defeats were God's punishment for the worship of images. The iconoclasts' image breakers argued that only God could be depicted, not Christ in his human nature. The iconodules' image venerators argued that the incarnation made images possible. The conspiracy theory, one that modern scholarship has largely embraced, is that iconoclasm was not primarily a theological movement. It was a conspiracy by the military aristocratic class to strip the monasteries of their wealth and power. Consider the evidence. The monasteries were the backbone of icon veneration. They were also massive landowners who controlled vast wealth and were exempt from many taxes. The iconoclast emperors, Leo III, Constantine V, Leo IV, systematically persecuted monks, confiscated monastic property, and forced monks and nuns into marriage. Constantine V in particular was relentless, turning the imperial machinery against the monastic establishment. The conspiracy extended to the army. Constantine V was a brilliant general who restructured the military and won significant victories against the Arabs and the Bulgars. He used his military success to legitimize his iconoclast policies. The army, which benefited from the redistribution of monastic lands and the centralization of resources, became the backbone of the iconoclast regime. The counter-conspiracy was equally fierce. The iconodules, led by the monks and supported by the popes in Rome, engaged in a campaign of resistance that included forgery, propaganda, and outright rebellion. They produced a vast body of literature arguing for icons, and they forged documents, most famously the Letter of Christ to Abgar, to give their position ancient authority. The conspiracy reached its climax in 787, when Empress Irene, acting as regent for her young son Constantine VI, convened the Second Council of Nicaea, which restored icons. But the victory was temporary. The iconoclasts returned to power under Leo V in 815, and the conflict continued until 843, when Empress Theodora finally restored icons for good. What the iconoclast conspiracy reveals is the extent to which religious disputes in Byzantium were entangled with class warfare, military politics, and imperial power. The question of images was not just a theological abstraction, it was a battleground for control of the empire's resources and its soul. The poisoned chalice, the conspiracy of the Empress Theophano. In the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire was ruled by a series of soldier emperors who had seized power through military coups. The most dramatic conspiracy of this period involves Theophano, a woman of humble origins who became empress and was accused of poisoning her husband, the emperor. The official story: Theophano was married to Romanos II, who died in 963 at the age of 26. Theophano then married the general Nikephoros Phocas, who became Emperor Nikephoros II. In 969, Nikephoros was murdered in his bedchamber by Theophano and her lover, the general John Tzimiskes, who then became Emperor John I. The conspiracy theory, one that has been debated for a millennium, is whether Theophano was the mastermind of a cold-blooded assassination or a pawn in a larger game played by the military aristocracy. Let us examine the evidence. Romanos II died suddenly after a hunting trip. Contemporary sources whisper of poison. If Theophano poisoned her first husband, then she was already a murderer when she married Nikephoros. But there is no conclusive proof. Nikephoros Phocas was an aging, ascetic soldier who had been forced into marriage with Theophano to legitimize his claim to the throne. He was reportedly unappealing, short, dark, with a forbidding countenance. He was also deeply unpopular with the church and the people. Theophano, by contrast, was young, beautiful, and ambitious. The murder of Nikephoros was a palace conspiracy of the most classic sort. On the night of December 10th to 11th, 969, a group of conspirators led by John Tzimiskes, Theophano's lover, entered the imperial palace through a window. They found Nikephoros sleeping on a bearskin on the floor. His ascetic habits had not changed. He was stabbed to death. According to some accounts, Theophano herself helped the conspirators enter and then watched as her husband was killed. But here is the deeper conspiracy. Theophano may have been the scapegoat. John Tzimiskes was a brilliant general with the support of the army. He had the motive and the means to murder Nikephoros. After the assassination, he seized the throne. But he could not be seen as a usurper and a murderer. So the blame fell on Theophano. She was publicly humiliated, stripped of her title, and exiled. John Tzimiskes, meanwhile, was crowned emperor and later praised by chroniclers as a just ruler. The conspiracy was successful. Theophano was erased from the official narrative as a scheming poisoner, while John Tzimiskes was rehabilitated. Only later historians, reading between the lines, have suggested that Theophano may have been less a villain and more a victim, a woman used by the military aristocracy to legitimize their seizure of power, then discarded when she was no longer useful. The Fourth Crusade, the conspiracy to destroy Constantinople. In 1204, the armies of the Fourth Crusade, nominally on their way to liberate Jerusalem, instead sacked Constantinople. They looted the city, defiled its churches, and established a Latin empire that lasted for 57 years. The Byzantine Empire was shattered, and it never fully recovered. The official story: the Crusaders were diverted from their mission by Venetian merchants who saw an opportunity to destroy their commercial rival. The Crusaders were promised money and supplies by a Byzantine pretender, Alexios IV Angelos, who claimed he would reunite the church with Rome if they helped him seize the throne. When Alexios could not pay, the Crusaders turned on the city. The conspiracy theory, one that has been explored in countless books, is that the Fourth Crusade was not a series of unfortunate accidents. It was a deliberate, long-planned conspiracy by the Republic of Venice to destroy the Byzantine Empire and replace it with a Venetian-dominated trading empire. The key figure is Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice. He was blind, in his 90s, and one of the most brilliant political minds of the Middle Ages. The Crusaders needed ships to reach Egypt, the intended target. Venice agreed to build them, for a massive sum. When the Crusaders could not pay, Dandolo offered a deal. They would pay their debt by capturing the port of Zara, a Christian city that was a commercial rival to Venice. They did so, despite the Pope's excommunication. Then came Alexios Angelos. He offered the Crusaders even more money and military support if they would restore his father to the Byzantine throne. Dandolo saw his opportunity. The capture of Constantinople would give Venice control of the Bosphorus, the Black Sea trade, and the most lucrative markets in the world. The siege of Constantinople in 1204 was brutal. The Crusaders breached the walls, and for 3 days they pillaged the city, the greatest repository of classical art and Christian relics in the world. They melted down ancient statues for coin. They stole the 4 bronze horses that had stood in the Hippodrome, now in Venice. They violated the Hagia Sophia, installing a prostitute on the patriarchal throne. The conspiracy theory is that Dandolo orchestrated the entire sequence of events. He manipulated the Crusaders, exploited the Byzantine civil wars, and used the pretext of religious unity to mask a commercial conquest. The fact that Venice emerged from the Fourth Crusade as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean is the proof of the conspiracy's success. The sack of Constantinople was a wound that never healed. It created a deep, enduring hatred between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, a schism that would make any future reunification impossible. When the Ottoman Turks finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, many Orthodox Christians reportedly preferred the turban of the Turk to the mitre of the Latin Pope. The conspiracy of the Fourth Crusade had made that hatred permanent. Archaeological conspiracies, what the ground reveals. History is written by the victors, but archaeology is written by the dead. In the modern era, forensic science, archaeology, and textual analysis have uncovered truths about Roman conspiracies that the ancient sources tried to bury. These are not theories, they are facts excavated from the soil. The mass graves, physical evidence of Republican terror. For centuries, the stories of the proscriptions, the lists of enemies of the state posted in the forum, whose murder brought a reward, were considered exaggerations. How many people could Sulla or the triumvirs have really killed? The ancient sources gave numbers in the thousands, but these were dismissed as rhetorical flourishes. Then came the archaeology. In the 1980s, excavations in Rome began uncovering mass graves dating to the late Republic. These were not plague pits or battlefield burials. They were chaotic, unceremonious dumps of human remains, bodies thrown into wells, stacked in abandoned quarries, left in the foundations of new buildings. The forensic analysis of these remains revealed a pattern: blunt force trauma to the head, bound hands, the kinds of injuries consistent with execution, not battle. The most significant find was in the Esquiline Hill, the traditional dumping ground for the bodies of the poor and the executed. Here, archaeologists found hundreds of skeletons dating to the period of Sulla's proscriptions in 82 to 81 BCE. The bodies showed signs of hasty, disrespectful burial. Coins found with the remains were dated to the period. The ancient sources claimed Sulla killed 1,500 senators and equestrians, and countless more common citizens. The mass graves confirmed that the scale of the killing was not exaggeration. It was literal truth. Similarly, excavations in the Campus Martius revealed mass graves from the proscriptions of the Second Triumvirate in 43 to 42 BCE, when Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus hunted down their enemies, including Cicero. The ground told the story that the texts had only hinted at. The Roman Republic did not fall through political maneuvering. It was drowned in blood. The conspiracies to seize power were real, and the mass graves are their silent witnesses. The Londinium skulls, the Boudiccan conspiracy. In 60 to 61 CE, the British Queen Boudica led a massive rebellion against Roman rule. Her forces destroyed Camulodunum Colchester, Londinium London, and Verulamium St. Albans, killing an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 Romans and British allies. The official story, told by Tacitus, is that Boudica was provoked by the rapacity of Roman officials who had seized her lands, flogged her, and raped her daughters. The conspiracy theory, one that has been supported by archaeological discoveries in London, is that the Roman provincial administration deliberately provoked the rebellion to crush it and consolidate power. The evidence comes from the Walbrook River in London. In recent decades, construction projects in the City of London have uncovered hundreds of skulls in the Walbrook's ancient bed. These are not random burials. They are the remains of victims of the Boudiccan massacre, Roman civilians who were butchered as they tried to flee the city. But the dating of these remains, and the archaeological context of the destruction layers in London, suggests something disturbing. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, may have abandoned Londinium to its fate. Tacitus records that Suetonius, hearing of the rebellion, marched toward London but then decided he could not defend it. He left the city to the rebels. The conspiracy theory: Suetonius deliberately sacrificed Londinium to draw Boudica into a battle on ground of his choosing. He let tens of thousands of Roman civilians die to secure a military victory. The skulls in the Walbrook are the physical evidence of that decision, a conspiracy of military expediency over human life. Suetonius did eventually defeat Boudica at the Battle of Watling Street, slaughtering the rebel army and her people. But the conspiracy was uncovered in Rome, and Suetonius was recalled and replaced. The archaeological record, however, preserves the truth. The man who saved the province was also the man who allowed its capital to be destroyed. The cursed tablets, the conspiracy of the courtroom. One of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries from Roman Britain is the collection of curse tablets from the spring of Sulis Minerva in Bath. These were small sheets of lead inscribed with curses against wrongdoers, thieves, liars, rivals. They were folded and thrown into the sacred spring, calling upon the goddess to exact justice. Among these tablets, archaeologists have found something extraordinary: curses related to legal disputes. One tablet, now famous, curses a man named Saturninus and his associates, asking the goddess to kill him in the court, in the trial. Another asks the goddess to silence the accuser. The conspiracy theory that these tablets reveal is the widespread use of ritual magic to influence the Roman legal system. We tend to think of Roman justice as a model of rationality: the law of the 12 tables, Cicero's speeches, the digest of Justinian. But the curse tablets suggest a parallel universe of superstition and conspiracy, where litigants sought not to argue their case but to use supernatural means to destroy their opponents. This was a conspiracy of the powerless. The Roman legal system was heavily biased toward the wealthy and the well-connected. For a poor litigant, a curse tablet was a form of weapon of the weak, a way to fight back against a system that was rigged against them. The tablets reveal a society where the official narrative of justice masked a reality of corruption, bribery, and supernatural warfare. The lead poisoning theory, the conspiracy of the aqueducts. For decades, a popular theory held that the Roman Empire fell because the elite poisoned themselves with lead. They drank from lead pipes, cooked in lead pots, and sweetened their wine with lead acetate sugar of lead. The theory was that lead poisoning caused infertility, madness, and the decline of the Roman aristocracy. This theory has now been largely debunked by archaeological science, but the conspiracy behind it is fascinating. The lead poisoning theory was popularized in the 20th century by the author Jerome Nriegu and others. It gained traction because it offered a neat, biological explanation for the fall of Rome, appealing to a modern audience concerned with environmental toxins. But the conspiracy theory is not about the lead, it is about the narrative. The lead poisoning theory was used to distract from more complex explanations for Rome's fall: political instability, economic collapse, military overstretch, and climate change. It was a seductive simplification that turned a nuanced historical question into a simple story of poison. The truth, revealed by modern analysis of Roman bones, is that lead levels in Roman populations were elevated but not catastrophic. The Roman elite did suffer from lead exposure, but it was not the cause of the empire's decline. The conspiracy was in the popularization of a flawed theory that obscured the real, more complicated history. The Lost Legions, the conspiracy of Teutoburg. In 9 CE, 3 Roman legions, the 17, 18, and 19, were annihilated in the Teutoburg forest by a coalition of Germanic tribes led by Arminius, a Roman-trained chieftain. The defeat was so catastrophic that the legion numbers were never used again. The official story, told by Cassius Dio and Velleius Paterculus, is that Arminius betrayed his Roman allies and ambushed the legions as they marched through the forest. For centuries, the exact site of the battle was unknown. The conspiracy theory that circulated among historians was that the Romans had covered up the location, that the Emperor Augustus, in his grief, ordered the site to be forgotten, a damnatio memoriae of the ground itself. Then, in 1987, a British amateur archaeologist named Tony Clun discovered the site of the battle near Kalkreis, Germany. The excavation that followed uncovered a killing field stretching for miles, the remains of Roman armor, sling bullets, coins, and human bones. The evidence confirmed the ancient accounts. The legions had been strung out in a marching column, trapped in a narrow pass between a hill and a marsh, and systematically slaughtered over 3 days. But the conspiracy was not about the location. It was about what happened after. The archaeological evidence suggests that the Germanic tribes did not just kill the Romans, they conducted ritual sacrifices of the prisoners, hanging them from trees, burning them in cages and mutilating the bodies. The Roman sources barely mention this, perhaps because it was too horrific to recount. The deeper conspiracy: Augustus deliberately downplayed the disaster. He went into mourning, tearing his clothes and crying, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." But he never sent a punitive expedition to recover the legionary standards. He abandoned the province of Germania. The conspiracy was to present the defeat as a tragic accident rather than a catastrophic failure of Roman intelligence and military strategy. Arminius had been a Roman citizen, a member of the equestrian order, a trusted ally. His betrayal exposed the vulnerability of the Roman intelligence network and the fragility of the empire's borders. Augustus and his successors buried that truth beneath a narrative of barbarian treachery. The Domus Aurea, Nero's hidden conspiracy. The Domus Aurea, Nero's golden house, was one of the most extravagant palaces ever built. After the Great Fire of 64 CE, Nero seized vast tracts of land in the center of Rome, including the Oppian Hill, and built a sprawling complex of pavilions, gardens, and a colossal statue of himself. The official story, pushed by his enemies, was that the Domus Aurea was the height of imperial megalomania, a monument to Nero's insanity. The conspiracy theory, one that has been validated by modern archaeology, is that the Domus Aurea was not a vanity project but a deliberate political statement designed to erase the old aristocratic power structure of Rome. When the Domus Aurea was excavated in the Renaissance and more thoroughly in the 20th century, archaeologists discovered something remarkable. The palace was built over the ruins of the old Republican elite. Nero had deliberately chosen to build his palace on land that had been owned by the aristocratic families who had opposed him. The Domus Aurea was not just a palace, it was a political tombstone, a monument to the defeat of the senatorial class. The conspiracy extended to the fire itself. Nero's enemies claimed he started the fire to clear the land for his palace. Modern archaeological evidence, however, suggests that the fire was likely accidental, but Nero exploited it ruthlessly. He used the destruction to push through land reforms, to seize property, and to rebuild the city in a more rational, less flammable way. The Domus Aurea was the centerpiece of this new Rome, a Rome that was Nero's, not the Senate's. When Nero died, his successors buried the Domus Aurea, building the Colosseum over the site of the artificial lake and covering the palace with earth. This was a damnatio memoriae in concrete. For centuries, the Domus Aurea was forgotten, known only from ancient texts. Its rediscovery in the Renaissance, when artists like Raphael were lowered into its underground chambers on ropes, revealed the scale of Nero's ambition and the depth of the conspiracy to erase him. Modern conspiracies: how we inherited the Roman narrative. The conspiracies of ancient Rome did not end with the fall of the Western Empire. They have persisted into the modern era, shaping how we understand history, politics, and power. This final section explores how the Roman conspiracy narrative has been inherited, weaponized, and reimagined in the modern world. The Holy Roman Empire, the conspiracy of the name. In 800 CE, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. The official story: Charlemagne had saved the papacy from its enemies, and the imperial title was a reward for his services to Christendom. The conspiracy theory: the coronation was a deliberate, premeditated act to create a rival to the Byzantine Empire and to establish the papacy as the power behind a new Western Empire. Charlemagne was a Frankish king, not a Roman. He had no connection to the Roman Senate, the Roman people, or the Roman military. But the title gave him legitimacy. It also gave the Pope immense power. The Pope could make emperors. The conspiracy was to create a new Roman Empire in the West that was, in reality, a German kingdom with a papal blessing. The Holy Roman Empire, neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, as Voltaire famously quipped, lasted for 1,000 years. Its very name was a conspiracy, a claim to continuity with ancient Rome that was almost entirely fictional. But it shaped the politics of Europe for centuries, creating a rivalry between the emperor and the pope, between the German princes and the Italian cities, that defined the Middle Ages. The conspiracy of the name was so successful that even today, we still refer to this entity as the Holy Roman Empire, perpetuating the fiction that it was in some way a continuation of ancient Rome. The Perrin thesis, the conspiracy of the historians. In the 20th century, the Belgian historian Henri Perrin proposed a revolutionary theory: the Roman Empire did not fall to the barbarians. It was killed by the rise of Islam. The Perrin thesis argued that Mediterranean trade continued uninterrupted after the Germanic invasions, and that the Roman world persisted until the Arab conquests of the 7th century severed the Mediterranean, redirecting trade northward and creating the conditions for medieval Europe. The conspiracy theory: Perrin was not simply proposing a historical argument, he was challenging the entire nationalist narrative of European history. For centuries, European historians had celebrated the Germanic tribes as the founders of modern Europe. Perrin's thesis suggested that the Germanic invasions were not a transformative event. They were a sideshow. The real transformation came from outside Europe, from Islam. Perrin's thesis was controversial and, in its strong form, has been largely rejected by modern historians. But the conspiracy behind it, the attempt to rewrite European history to downplay the role of the Germanic peoples and emphasize the continuity of Roman civilization, reveals how historical narratives are always political. Perrin was a Belgian who had lived through the German occupation of World War I. His thesis was, in part, a reaction against German nationalist historiography that glorified the Germanic past. The conspiracy was an academic one, the use of historical argument to challenge contemporary political claims. The Protocols of the Elders of Rome, a modern forger's conspiracy. In the early 20th century, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a notorious anti-Semitic forgery, claimed to reveal a Jewish conspiracy for world domination. Less well known is that the Protocols drew heavily on earlier works of fiction, including a 19th-century French satire that imagined a Roman conspiracy to control the world. The connection is this: in 1864, the French author Maurice Joly wrote The Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, a satire of Napoleon III authoritarianism. In the dialogue, Joly imagined a conspiracy by a secret society to seize power using techniques drawn from the Roman Empire: divide and conquer, control of the media, manipulation of public opinion. The Protocols plagiarized large sections of Joly's work, replacing references to Machiavelli and Rome with references to Jewish elders. The conspiracy theory of a Roman-style secret cabal controlling the world was repurposed for modern antisemitism. What this reveals is the enduring power of the Roman conspiracy narrative. The idea that Rome was run by hidden cabals, that the Senate was a shadow government, that emperors were puppets of secret masters, these ideas were not invented in antiquity. But they have been recycled, adapted, and weaponized in every era since. The Roman conspiracy is the template for all subsequent conspiracy theories about hidden power. The lost city of Rome, the conspiracy of Eurasia. Finally, we come to a conspiracy that is still unfolding: the erasure of Rome from the historical record. Every year, new discoveries in the Roman Forum, on the Palatine Hill, and beneath the streets of modern Rome reveal that the city we think we know is a fraction of the city that actually existed. The conspiracy is not that someone is hiding this. It is that the narrative we have inherited, of a linear history, of clear causes and effects, of virtuous republic and decadent empire, is a simplification so extreme that it constitutes a kind of lie. The real Rome was messier, more violent, more complicated, and more interesting than the Rome of our textbooks. Consider the recent discoveries beneath the Palatine Hill. In 2014, archaeologists discovered a series of chambers dating to the 1st century BCE, decorated with frescoes that suggest the presence of a high-ranking Roman family. But the chambers were deliberately filled in and built over, erased from the memory of the city. What secret did they contain? What conspiracy required their burial? Or consider the recent excavations of the Vicus Tuscus, a street in the Forum that was once a center of commerce. The discoveries there reveal layers of destruction and rebuilding that the ancient sources never mention. Were there fires, riots, or demolitions that the chroniclers chose to forget? The conspiracy of erasure is not a plot by a secret cabal. It is the cumulative effect of centuries of historical writing that preferred neat narratives to messy truths. We have inherited a version of Rome that was crafted by the winners, the senators who hated the emperors, the Orthodox Christians who hated the heretics, the Renaissance humanists who idealized the Republic. The conspiracy is the narrative itself. The ongoing conspiracy, what we still don't know. As this work draws to a close, it is worth reflecting on what we still do not know. For all the archaeology, all the textual analysis, all the forensic science, there are Roman conspiracies that remain hidden, their secrets buried beneath the soil or lost in the gaps of the historical record. What was the true fate of Romulus? Did the patricians tear him apart, and if so, was the storm the most successful cover-up in history? Who really killed the Gracchi? Was it a spontaneous riot, as the Senate claimed, or was it a premeditated assassination ordered by the oligarchy? What did the Sibylline books contain? Why were they so carefully guarded, and why were they eventually lost? Did they contain predictions that were too dangerous to preserve? What was the real relationship between the emperor and the Praetorian Guard? Were the guards the protectors of the emperor or his jailers? How many emperors died in conspiracies that we will never fully understand? Was the Christianization of the empire a genuine conversion or a political coup? How much of the history of the early church is propaganda, and how much is fact? These questions will likely never be answered definitively. But the pursuit of them is the pursuit of the real Rome, the Rome of shadows, of whispers, of conspiracies that succeeded and conspiracies that failed. Ancient Rome was the first great laboratory of political conspiracy. It was in the Roman Forum, in the halls of the Senate, in the bedchambers of the Palatine, that the techniques of modern power politics were invented. Propaganda, disinformation, the manipulation of public opinion, the use of state terror, the creation of parallel power structures, the rewriting of history. What we learn from the study of Roman conspiracies is that conspiracy is not an aberration from normal politics. It is normal politics. The Roman Republic was not destroyed by conspiracies from without, it was destroyed by conspiracies from within. The Roman Empire was not a system of stable, orderly governance, it was a system of permanent intrigue, where every succession was a potential crisis, every general a potential usurper, every emperor a potential victim. And yet, Rome endured. For over 1,000 years in the West, and for another 1,000 in the East, the Roman system, flawed, brutal, conspiratorial, persisted. It persisted because the conspiracies, for all their destructiveness, also served a purpose. They were the mechanism by which power was negotiated, by which the ambitions of individuals were channeled into the structures of the state. The Senate's conspiracies against the Gracchi preserved the power of the oligarchy. Augustus's conspiracy to restore the Republic preserved the reality of monarchy. The Church's conspiracies to define orthodoxy preserved the unity of Christendom. We are the heirs of Rome. The political institutions of the modern world, the Senate, the law, the executive, the military, are Roman in origin. And so are the conspiracies. The whisper campaigns of modern politics, the deep state theories, the manipulation of the media, the rewriting of history to serve the powerful, all of these have Roman precedents. To study Roman conspiracies is to study ourselves. We look into the marble and see our own faces reflected. The questions that consumed the Romans, who rules, by what right, with what consequences, are the questions that consume us. Their conspiracies were our conspiracies, played out in togas and sandals. The echoes in the marble are not just the whispers of the dead. They are the voices of the living, still caught in the eternal pattern of power and intrigue that Rome perfected 2,000 years ago. The conspiracy, it turns out, never ended. It just changed its clothes.